Everyone. Good morning and welcome to our training session today on the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. My name is Claudine Allen and I'm a lead Native Hawaiian program specialist in HUD's Honolulu office. I administer the day-to-day operations of our Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program and our Section 184A Loan Guarantee Program. So I work very closely with Lehua and her team of NHHBG staff, and I'm very happy to be here to offer this training today. So our first training session was about 2 weeks ago. I did a general overview of the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program and a very short introduction of the Section 184A Loan Guarantee Program. And I also identified a list of the program requirements that are applicable to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. And so these subsequent training sessions are designed to do a deeper dive into some of those program requirements. So for today's session, we're going to focus in on the program requirements pertaining to eligible families and determining income eligibility for NHHBG assistance. Again, welcome. So the purpose of today's meeting is to provide training, and I wanted to turn my camera on to introduce myself, but for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to turn off my camera to try to have everyone focus their attention on the slides. But as Lehua mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Or if you could wait until after the presentation is over, we'll definitely set time aside for question and answers at that time. So mahalo for your cooperation. So the purpose of today's training is to provide training, of course, to the Department of Hawaiian Homeland's personnel, as well as other NHHBG program participants. I want to try to ensure awareness of all of our NHHBG program requirements and the guidance that we have available to assist all of DHHL and their service providers to implement the program. Another reason for the training is to help DHHL determine whether its current written policies and procedures are sufficient or if any updates are needed. So today, again, we'll be focusing on the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant and the requirements that pertain to this program. So the Department of Hawaiian Homelands is the sole recipient of the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant. So DHHL and any of their sub-recipients or contractors that will be on board to help DHHL implement their NHHBG program activities are all required to comply with what we call the statute or the law that governs the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. And that statute is Title 8 of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act. And we refer to that in the acronym called NHHBG. HUD created regulations to help implement this statute, and thus the NHHBG program regulations are located at 24 CFR Part 1006. And there are also other related federal regulations that have requirements that are applicable to this program. So long story short, DHHL and all of their subrecipients and contractors must comply with the statutory requirements as well as the regulatory requirements applicable to this program. And as I mentioned earlier, for today's session, we're going to focus in on the program requirements pertaining to eligible families and determining income eligibility for NHHBG assistance. I also added a bullet on this slide that refers to DHHL's written policies governing the eligibility, admission, and occupancy of families for housing assisted with NHHBG funds. And I will discuss that in a little more detail as we get through the presentation. So this is a slide that if you participated in our first training session, it may look familiar to you. And I start off with this just to give a general explanation of the NHHBG program. Basically, NHHBG provides affordable housing opportunities to low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on the Hawaiian homelands. And you're going to notice throughout the slides that I'm going to reference where in the NHHBG statute and where in the NHHBG regulation you can find the citation for a lot of this information that I'm discussing. So let me break this down a little bit. NHHBG provides affordable housing. So what do we mean by affordable housing? Affordable housing is housing units that are developed or assisted with NHHBG funds. And so you may hear me interchangeably use the term NHHBG and NHHBG for Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant, but basically I'm talking about the same thing. So housing that is either built or assisted with NHHBG funds, as well as housing that meets the requirements of NHHBG. And I will explain a little bit more about what that means as we go through the presentation as well. Low income means families who have a household income that does not exceed 80% of the median income for the area. And then when we talk about Native Hawaiian families, it's really Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. And of course, we know that the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act is the governing statute for Hawaiian homelands. Thus, DHHO determines which families are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands pursuant to the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. As far as the housing area, when we're talking about providing housing and housing assistance, it's generally on Hawaiian homelands for home ownership activities, but it could be on or off Hawaiian homelands when we're talking about rental housing assistance. And this is actually a change from when the program first started as far as defining the housing area. When this program first started, we were only looking at housing on Hawaiian homelands. But since 2018 and up to current, whenever Congress has appropriated funds for the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program, within that appropriation language, Congress has authorized DHHO to use their NHHBG funds to provide rental assistance for eligible Native Hawaiian families, both on and off Hawaiian homelands. So that's why there's that distinguishing factor. I also wanted to discuss a little bit about the non-discrimination requirements applicable to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant. So this NHHBG program is one of those programs that we at HUD call has a carve-out for assisting a specific targeted population. And in this case, that targeted population are Native Hawaiians. Otherwise, most HUD programs are supposed to be open and available to any sector of the population, according to fair housing law. But under the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant, program eligibility under NHHBG may be restricted to Native Hawaiians. Subject to that, however, no person may be discriminated against on the basis of these protected classes, which is on the basis of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, or disability. And no family shall be excluded from program eligibility on the basis of whether actual or perceived, based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. And so again, because this program is allowed to discriminate on the basis of race in this case for Native Hawaiians, we can specify eligibility for Native Hawaiians. But aside from that, all families are still protected based on these other protected classes. And so NHHBG states that the following non-discrimination requirements apply to NHHBG. There are protections under the Age Discrimination Act of 1975, protections under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, And then, of course, the protected classes that I described earlier are covered under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, as well as the equal access to HUD-assisted or insured housing requirements. So when we talk about NHHBG eligible families, I wanted to explain that one primary objective of Title VIII of NHHSDA is to assist and promote affordable housing activities to develop, maintain, and operate affordable housing in safe and healthy environments for the occupancy by low-income Native Hawaiian families. So generally, NHHBG assisted is limited to low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside in the Hawaiian homelands, but there are some exceptions to the low-income requirement. One of those exceptions is that assistance for home ownership activities may be made available to non-low-income Native Hawaiian families as approved by HUD. And this would be to address a need for housing that cannot be reasonably be met without this assistance for those non-low-income families. DHHL must determine and document that housing need for non-low-income families. And again, this would be using this exception would be limited only to providing home ownership activities. Because I'm sure, as most of you are familiar, NHHBG funds can be used to provide a wide variety type of housing assistance activities that includes both home ownership and rental. But in this case, to use this exception to the low-income requirement, it's only limited to home ownership activities. And for whatever reason, that is how NHHSDA is written. I also put a note here at the bottom of the slide that housing assisted pursuant to this section in the regulation, providing home ownership activities to non-low-income Native Hawaiian families shall be considered affordable housing for purposes of NHHSDA. And so I had mentioned that I would discuss affordable housing in a little more detail as we get through the presentation. So typically, affordable housing would be housing that was either built or is being assisted with NHHSDA funds or meets the requirements of affordable housing under NHHSDA. So if the housing is occupied by low-income Native Hawaiian families, it's considered affordable housing. And then that triggers other types of requirements, one of them being this useful life affordability restriction, which actually we will discuss in much more detail in a training session that we have upcoming 2 weeks from today. But in this case, if DHHL exercises this ability to provide home ownership activities to non-low-income Native Hawaiian families, then that housing unit would be considered affordable housing as well for the purposes of NHHSDA, and thus that, for example, that housing unit would be subject to useful life affordability restrictions. So we are really getting into the weeds in some of these requirements, and that's the purpose of these subsequent training sessions, is to dive a little deeper into these program requirements to explain them a little further. Continuing on with our discussion on eligible families, there are limitations as far as being able to assist families who have income that exceed that 80% of area median income. DHHL may use up to 10% of the amount planned to be used, of the amount of NHHBG funds planned to be used in its Native Hawaiian housing plan for families whose income is between 81% and 100% of area median income. So DHHL can use 10% of that budgeted plan amount for families that fall between 81% and 100% of area median income without HUD approval. This is a change that was recently made to the NHHBG regulation with updates that we made to the regulation effective March 15th of this year. So note, HUD approval is required, however, if DHHL plans to exceed that 10% cap, or if DHHL wanted to provide housing assistance for families with income that exceeds 100% of area median income. So again, DHHL may assist up to 10% of their housing planned amount for families between 81% and 100% without HUD approval. But if DHHL plans to exceed that 10% cap, or if they want to assist families that have incomes greater than 100% of area median income, then DHHL must request HUD approval for those situations. DHHL could request the HUD approval by submitting a proposal in their housing plan submission, or by submitting a request for amendment to their housing plan, or anytime during the program year. There's also a limitation where non-low income families who may be assisted, they cannot receive the same amount of benefits that are provided to low-income Native Hawaiian families. Because this program is generally designed to assist low-income families, but if DHHL wants to assist families who are not low-income, then there needs to be, DHHL needs to determine within their written policies what amount of assistance the non-low-income families may be eligible to receive. It just cannot be the same level of assistance that are received by low-income Native Hawaiian families. And so in this regard, DHHL has some discretion to determine what that level of assistance would be for the non-low-income families. So the requirements that I just described in bullet 1 and bullet 2 above do not apply to other families who are non-low income and determined to be essential families by DHHL under the next bullet that I'm going to describe. So another exception to the low income requirement is that DHHL may provide housing or some type of NHHBG assistance to families who are non-low income and also non-Native Hawaiian. And thus, I put in quotations there, essential families. DHHL may provide housing or any type of NHHBG assistance to these families without HUD approval if DHHL determines and documents that the presence of these families in the housing involved is essential to the well-being of the Native Hawaiian families, and the need for housing for these families cannot be reasonably be met without this assistance. Now, keep in mind that this is something that NHHBG allows, but I also understand that under the governance of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, this may not necessarily be something that DHHL would or could pursue as far as assisting non-Native Hawaiian families. But what I'm explaining is what's made available specifically under NHHBG. Okay. All right. Now, I did mention that DHHL is required to have certain types of written policies, and this is a requirement under NHHBG. First, DHHL must have written policies that is available for review. DHHL must develop and enforce these written policies and have them available for review. And one of those would be written policies that governs the eligibility, admission, and occupancy of families for housing that is assisted with NHHBG funds, as well as the selection of families receiving other assistance under NHHBG. DHHL does have a written policy that meets this criteria, and if you're interested, then I'm sure you can discuss with Lehua about accessing their NHHBG General Admissions and Occupancy Policy and other policies that DHHL has in place for its NHHBG programs. The second type of written policy that NHHBG requires DHHL have in place is written policies that governs the rents and lease purchase payments charged for rental housing units that are assisted with NHHBG funds. And that policy must also include methods by which these rents and lease purchase payments are determined. So this would be a policy that covers these types of requirements. But NHHSDA does specifically require that the maximum monthly tenant rent payment may not exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. So this is a separate topic that I won't be really getting into very much in today's session, but just be aware that this is another type of written policy that DHHL must have in place. The third type of written policy that NHHSDA requires, DHHL must have written policies in place that governs the management and maintenance of rental housing that is assisted with NHHBG funds. Okay, so these are the three different categories of written policies that DHHL must have in place. Now let's talk a little bit about NHHBG income eligibility. So there is a section in the regulation that talks about low income requirements and income targeting, which means, when does DHHL have to determine income eligibility for families? As I mentioned before, housing qualifies as affordable housing for purposes of Title VIII of NHHSDA, provided that the family occupying the unit is low income. And they must be determined low income at the following times, depending on this type of category that's listed here. When we're talking about rental housing, the family must be determined low income at the time of initial occupancy of the rental housing unit. When we're talking about housing for homeownership, then the family must be determined low income at the time of purchase. I understand that DHHL has different scenarios with regard to homeownership housing, and some of those scenarios involve getting a loan to purchase that home. When DHHL enters into a loan contract with the family for NHHBG assistance to either purchase or construct a home ownership unit, then the time of purchase means when that loan contract is executed. So if it's not a straight outright purchase by the family for a home ownership unit, and instead that purchase involves a loan contract, then of course the time of purchase equals when that loan contract is executed for that home ownership unit. And that is the moment when the family must be determined low income to see if they're eligible for NHHBG assistance. The next category would be owner-occupied housing. So we do have existing housing units on Hawaiian homelands that are occupied by lessees. And if that lessee is applying for NHHBG assistance for their owner-occupied housing unit, then that family must be determined low income at the time the family receives the NHHBG assistance. So when they apply for that NHHBG assistance for their owner-occupied unit is when they must be determined low income. And then we have another scenario that may involve a lease purchase agreement. So for existing housing or housing to be constructed, then the family must be determined low income at that time the lease purchase agreement is signed. NHHSDA does not necessarily require the family to recertify for income eligibility when that rental unit converts to home ownership. So NHHSDA says, or our regulation says, that at that time the lease purchase agreement is signed, that is when the family must be determined low income to be eligible for assistance for a lease purchase unit. Now, there's another category for emergency assistance, and this would be to prevent home homelessness or to prevent foreclosure of that homeownership unit. Then that family must be determined low income at the time the family receives the NHHBG assistance. So if they're looking for emergency NHHBG assistance, whether it's for temporary housing payments to prevent them from being homeless or to prevent a lease cancellation on their housing unit, then when they apply for NHHBG, they must be determined low income at that time to receive the NHHBG assistance. All right, so that covers NHHBG income eligibility. I briefly mentioned another requirement of useful life affordability restrictions. So I'm going to touch on it very briefly here. But again, this will be a topic that we're going to dive deeper into in a training session that we have scheduled on April 18th. So this program requirement called Useful Life Affordability Restrictions applies to NHHBG assisted rental and home ownership units, where the affordable housing must meet affordability requirements for the remaining useful life of the property. And what this means is when NHHBG funds are used to invest into this housing unit, whether it's to build the unit or to rehab the unit or to provide financing for a family to purchase or rehabilitate this unit, those are just some examples, then there must be an affordability restriction placed on that unit to ensure that that affordable housing unit remains available to low-income families for a set period of time. DHHO determines that affordability period in its housing plan when they submit it to HUD for review. DHHL, through binding contractual agreements, is what will enforce and ensure that unit is made available for that long-term period. To make sure that that unit is made available to low-income families for that long-term period. And this binding agreement shall provide for enforcement by DHHL as well as HUD, and it should provide remedies in case there's a breach of that affordability restriction placed on the unit. So to make it a little easier, these binding contractual agreements are normally carried out through the lease on that leasehold interest through some type of lease amendment. And so there would be language in this lease amendment that will articulate the affordability restriction applicable to that housing unit. So again, we'll get into a deeper discussion on this requirement in our next training session. But just know that this is one of those requirements that gets triggered when the unit is considered an affordable housing unit. All right, let's talk now about income verification. So income verification is discussed in section 1006.306 in the regulation. And so when making the initial determination of whether this family is eligible for NHHBG assistance, DHHL must verify the family's income to determine that family is income eligible, and this would be based on anticipated annual income. The family is required to provide documentation to verify DHHL or the DHHL service provider's determination of income eligibility. So basically, you have to show your math to determine whether the family is income eligible. So DHHL is required to retain the income verification documentation that it collects on which the determination of income eligibility is based. DHHL may require the family to periodically verify. So what we're talking about here is initial eligibility to determine whether the family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. Beyond that, NHHSDA doesn't require periodic verification, but if DHHL decides that it wants to do periodic verification, then DHHL may require the family to periodically verify their income to either determine their housing payment or continued occupancy of the housing unit. And this would have to be carried out in consistent with DHHL's written policies. So if DHHL decides to require periodic verification, that must be established within DHHL's written policies. For families that were low income at the times described in the previous slide where I was talking about home ownership, rental housing, emergency assistance, and so on. So if a family was determined low income at those times that I described earlier, but subsequently becomes a non-low income family, meaning that their income increased, and so now their household income is greater than 80% of AMI, under NHHBG, those families may continue to participate in the program in accordance with DHHL's admission and occupancy policies. So again, as far as NHHBG goes, a family who was initially entered into the program based on being low income, they may continue to participate in the program. But if DHHL says otherwise in their written policies, then it would be however DHHL establishes their continuance in accordance with DHHL's written policies. I just wanted to also mention a note here that the 10% limit that was mentioned in the regulation that I described earlier, that where DHHL can use up to 10% of their housing plan budget for families to assist families who have incomes between 81% and 100%, that 10% income limit shall not apply to these families who were entered into the program at low income but later become non-low income. However, these families may be made subject to not receiving the same amount of assistance that low-income families receive, which was described in slide 7, just a couple slides earlier. So I know I'm really getting into the weeds here, and we can definitely discuss this later. But what I'm trying to do right now for this presentation is to outline the different scenarios and possible caveats that can be addressed in further detail later. Now from this portion of the presentation, I'm going to segue into determining income eligibility. We do have a NHHBG program guidance document. It's called 2013-02 that explains how to calculate annual income under the NHHBG program. That program guidance was written in 2013. And what I'm going to try to do is differentiate some updates that have been made to the NHHBG program since that program guidance was written. And those updates will be identified with red text in the upcoming slides in my presentation. So first of all, I want to describe where to find the NHHBG program guidance on HUD's website. So what I'm going to call the ONAP homepage is what we refer to as our Code Talk page. So you can type in hud.gov/code talk, and that will take you to this ONAP homepage. You can also get to it from this longer version of the link that's typed out here. But if you just type in hud.gov/code talk, that's a shortcut that will take you to our ONAP homepage, also known as our Code Talk page. So from the Code Talk page, you're going to see just this one link here. And if you hover your mouse over it, it's going to bring down this longer list of links that you can select from. So if you hover your mouse over select area of interest, that will produce this longer list of links that you can select from. And if you click on contacting ONAP and tribes, then it will show you this other list of links where you can contact the area ONAP offices. And what I'm trying to show you here is it'll bring up a link for the Hawaii ONAP office. I would like you to, when that link shows up, click on the Hawaii ONAP link. And that will bring you to our Native Hawaiian housing webpage. From this page, you can select either the NHHBG program or the Section 184A program to go straight to those web pages. So from this Native Hawaiian housing page, I recommend that you click on the NHHBG program link, and that will take you to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program page. From this page, under the category of helpful tools, you'll see a link for NHHBG program guidance. And when you click on that, that's where you're going to find the entire library and list of NHHBG program guidance documents. And that's where you're going to find this particular program guidance on calculating annual income under the NHHBG program. So if you click on NHHBG 2013-02, it will bring up this program guidance for you. I'm only showing you the first page of the program guidance, but by going through those links on the ONAP web pages, it'll take you to this program guidance where you can actually open it up. And I think it's about four, maybe 5 pages long. And so in the next slides, I'm going to actually go through that program guidance with you that explains how to calculate annual income under the NHHBG program. So that the purpose of this program guidance is to provide instructions on how to calculate annual income to determine eligibility for NHHBG assistance. The program guidance will list 3 definitions of annual income that DHHL may adopt in its written policies. And this program guidance also identifies statutory and federally mandated exclusions from annual income. This program guidance also provides some background information, some of which we've already discussed. Housing assistance under the NHHBG program is generally limited to low-income Native Hawaiian families. And in this section of the NHHBG regulation, 1000.10, where it lists the definitions that can be terms that are defined that may be used for, and those definitions may be used in the NHHBG program. So in 1006.10 is where you'll find the definition of a low-income family, which is a family whose income does not exceed 80% of the median income for the area. And then therefore, to determine if a family is eligible to receive assistance under the NHHBG program, DHHL must first determine a family's annual income. Now, you're going to see this text in red here because with the recent changes we made to the NHHBG regulation, we added some terms to be defined under the NHHBG regulation. And so with the changes we made to the NHHBG regulation, which became effective March 15, 2024, we've added a definition for the term income, and we've added a definition for the term annual income. Previous to that, this program regulation describes where to look for those definitions. But I can proudly say that now the NHHBG program has its own program term that defines the term income and annual income. This does not change the actual definition of what's been used in the past to identify or to define income and annual income. But what it does is it puts those definitions specifically in the NHHBG program regulation now. And so that's why I identified this area in red text. So income is defined as the term income is defined in Section 4.9 under the Statute of NHHBG. Income means income from all sources of each member of the household as determined in accordance with criteria prescribed by the HUD Secretary, except that the following amounts may not be considered as income under this paragraph. So when we're determining annual income, we're first looking at the definition of income under NHHBG. And the income under NHHBG does not include any amounts that are not actually received by the family. It does not include any amounts that would be eligible for exclusion under Section 1613A7 of the Social Security Act. And it does not include any amounts that are received by any member of the family, that is disability compensation or dependent and indemnity compensation under these laws of the Veterans Affairs. Next, we're going to look at the definition of annual income. Annual income has one or more of the following meanings as determined by DHHL in their written policies. So DHHL can select from these definitions of annual income. 1, annual income as defined for HUD Section 8 program in 24 CFR Part 5, Subpart F, or the definition of income as used by the U.S. Census Bureau, or adjusted gross income as defined for purposes of reporting under the IRS Form 1040 series. The reason why I have number 2, the definition of income as used by the U.S. Census Bureau in red text, is because the program guidance refers to the definition used by the U.S. Census Bureau in the long version form of that's used by the U.S. Census Bureau. So the program guidance refers to that long form used by the U.S. Census Bureau and the definition used to complete that form. It was brought to my attention when we were making recent changes to the NHHBG regulation that the U.S. Census Bureau doesn't use that particular long form anymore. And so that's why we've defined this option as the definition of income as used by the Census Bureau rather than that long form version. That's the only reason why this is identified in red text as an update. So the NHHBG regulation defines annual income as one of these 3 definitions as determined by DHHL. So what that means is DHHL can use one or more of these definitions in combination to define annual income for the NHHBG program. And then, of course, I also point in this slide to DHHL's NHHBG General Admissions and Occupancy Policy that was approved by the Hawaiian Homes Commission in July of 2021. And this would be the policy that would articulate how DHHL defines annual income. All right. So continuing on with the program guidance on how to calculate annual income under the NHHBG program. So again, calculating annual income is to determine if a family is eligible or income eligible for NHHBG assistance. DHHL and its NHHBG subrecipients and contractors must first determine a family's annual income. So to calculate annual income, please follow these steps that are outlined in the program guidance. So once DHHL has identified the definition of annual income that it's going to use, this just explains that DHHL may choose one or more of these definitions that I already briefly discussed on the previous slide. DHHL's policy may also state that it will use the definition that is most advantageous to the family or to DHHL. I would recommend that in DHHL's policy that they explain what they mean by advantageous. So in other words, if it's advantageous to the family, where DHHL may say they're going to use the IRS definition as well as a Section 8 definition to calculate annual income. And if one of those definitions calculates out to a higher annual income between the two, and then that higher annual income calculation is what DHHL considers more advantageous to the family to be able to qualify for NHHBG assistance, then I would just recommend making that clarification and explaining what it means by whichever definition is advantageous to the family or DHHL. So, that meaning of advantageous to the family could differ whether you're trying to say advantageous to DHHL. And so I would just recommend providing that type of clarification in DHHL's written policy. DHHL and its service provider must also show the math in their calculations when calculating annual income for the family. So showing that math would be using the income documentation that's being submitted to verify the family's annual income, and thus that documentation would be used in showing the math calculations and how DHHL came out with the actual calculation of what the annual income is for that family. And then in DHHL's written policy, DHHL should be implementing its admissions and occupancy policy with consistency for the different scenarios involved in determining eligibility for NHHBG assistance. Right? Annual income as defined for HUD Section 8 programs. So what the program guidance does is break down for each definition of annual income a little bit more explanation. So as we said, the different options of definition of annual income DHHL can choose from is the Section 8 definition of annual income, the census definition of annual income, and the IRS definition. So what we're going to do in the next few slides is break down and take a closer look at these three different definitions. So annual income as defined for HUD's Section 8 program in 24 CFR Part 5, Subpart F. This annual income, so this definition of annual income specifies what shall be included in that calculation of annual income when using the Section 8 definition, again, in 24 CFR Part 5.609. I made a notation here in red text to explain that on February 14th, 2023, another final rule was published by HUD that makes changes to this regulation at 24 CFR 5.609, pursuant to sections 102 and 104 of the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act of 2016, which is also referred to as HOTMA. So when the NHHBG program guidance was written, it referred to just that, the Section 8 definition of annual income. Very recently, changes pursuant to Section 102 and 104 of HOTMA, this statute, made changes to Section 5.609 under 24 CFR, the Section 8 definition of annual income. So one of those changes pursuant to Section 102 and 104 of HOTMA is that projecting income 12 months out is no longer required. Using income for the past 12 months is the new standard under one of these changes made pursuant to HOTMA. So unless you've already are familiar with this Section 8 definition of calculating annual income, this may sound very confusing. But for those who are already familiar with using the Section 8 definition to calculate annual income, I hope you're more familiar and understand with what I'm discussing here. Notice PIH 2024-06. So this document is a waiver that HUD put out with respect to DHHL using the Section 8 definition of annual income. This notice says that there is a waiver in place that allows DHHL a 1-year extension up to January 25, 2025 to implement and comply with the new Section 8 definition of annual income as modified by HOTMA. So this notice allows extra time for DHHL to update its policies, processes, and procedures. So it allows extra time up to January 5, 2025 to implement this new Section 8 definition of annual income as modified by HOTMA. But in the meantime, DHHL may continue to rely on the Section 8 definition of annual income contained at 24 CFR Part 5.609, which was in effect prior to the HOTMA changes. So it's really up to DHHL if it's going to use the Section 8 definition that was in place prior to the changes made by HOTMA. But at a minimum, starting on January 25th, 2025, DHHL must implement the Section 8 definition of annual income pursuant to the changes by HOTMA, starting no later than January 25th, 2025. To help DHHL with any resources that it may need to better understand the changes made to the Section 8 definition of annual income pursuant to HOTMA, I've listed some resources here on this slide. There's a link to HOTMA resources on HUD's website. There's also a link to recorded webinars that explain the HOTMA income and assets changes. And there's also a link on the HUD Exchange website to some income and assets fact sheets and resource sheets that I hope will be of some assistance if needed by DHHL in that regard. All right. The second definition of annual income is the one that's used by the Census Bureau. This means the definition of income used by the Census Bureau, not the actual dollar amount reported on the census long forms. You can search census.gov/glossary to look up the definition of income used by the U.S. Census Bureau if you're interested in using the census definition to determine annual income for NHHBG program purposes. Some information that was shared with me to distinguish one major difference between the Section 8 definition of annual income and the census definition of annual income is that the Section 8 definition excludes income of minors under the age of 18, whereas the census definition excludes income of minors under the age of 15. So again, that was something that was explained to me as one major difference between these two definitions. The third definition of annual income that's available is using adjusted gross income as defined for purposes of reporting under the IRS 1040 form when filing taxes for individuals for income tax purposes. So when using this IRS definition, it refers to the adjusted gross income as reported on the IRS form series filed by the household member. So if household members who earn income do not file an IRS 1040 series form, then the IRS definition may not be used as an option for calculating annual income for the family. But basically, if the IRS 1040 definition is used, then whatever adjusted gross income amount is reported on that 1040 form, that is considered the anticipated annual gross income amount for that family member. All right, the next step in calculating annual income, once it's determined what definition of annual income is going to be used, the next step, step 2, is to exclude any NHHBG exclusions from the calculation of income. So remember when we went over the definition of income under NHHBG, that you would make sure to exclude any of those amounts that are excluded from the definition of income. So after calculating a family's annual income under step 1, be sure to exclude any payments under these NHHBG exclusions. Then the third step would be to exclude any federally mandated exclusions. So these would be amounts that are specifically excluded under other federal statutes from the consideration of income for purposes of determining eligibility or benefits under a category of HUD assistance programs, which includes NHHBG. So these federally mandated exclusions are published in the Federal Register. HUD will periodically publish a notice in the Federal Register that identifies these federally mandated exclusions, and you can search the Federal Register at federalregister.gov for the most current notice of federally mandated exclusions. So usually what I do is a Google search, and I'll go to federalregister.gov. And once I'm at the Federal Register website, there is a window where you can do a search of federal registers, and then I'll enter in that search engine, federally mandated exclusions from income. And then what will pop up is a list of various links, and I'm going to look for the most recent Federal Register that was published on federally mandated exclusions from income. And so when I did my search on this before I prepared my training presentation, I found that the most recent federally published mandated exclusions from income was published on January 31st, 2024. And this provides a link to that Federal Register. But as time goes on, right, I always recommend going straight to the Federal Register and doing a search on federally mandated exclusions, because after today, I don't know when will be the next time HUD will publish the next update, but it's always good to go back to the source and do a search for this to find the most recent published federally mandated exclusions from income. And that's where you're going to find these other exclusions from income to do your calculation. Okay, so you're going to use your definition of annual income, subtract out the exclusions that are specifically determined under NHHBG, and then you're going to exclude the federally mandated exclusions from income. And then step 4 is to do income verification. DHHO must verify that a family is income eligible based on anticipated annual income. The family is required to provide income documentation to verify their income. And this is the documentation that DHHO and their program partners will be used to show their math. NHHBG does not dictate the type of documentation that is necessary for verifying income. So DHHO does have some discretion to determine the appropriate type of documentation in their written policies. DHHO could choose to use third-party income verification documentation, such as income tax returns, W-2s, pay stubs, etc. And that this would all be stipulated in DHHO's written policies. DHHO must have income verification policies in place and is required to maintain the income verification documentation on which their determination of eligibility is based. And then DHHL should it's just a recommendation, but DHHL may want to periodically take a look at their written policies to determine whether their policies need to be updated or their procedures updated as needed to ensure that similar situations are assessed consistently and fairly as they're dealing with different types of NHHBG assisted programs. Now, I want to note the difference between the term of annual income and adjusted income. Annual income is used to determine if a household is initially eligible to participate in the program, whether that family is income eligible to receive NHHBG assistance. Adjusted income is defined in the NHHBG regulation as 1006.10 as the annual, so adjusted income means the annual income that remains after excluding the amounts that are listed in 1006.10 of the NHHBG program regulations. So it identifies certain things, like a certain dollar amount if you have, say, minor children in the family. Pardon me. It may have exclusions if there's a, a member of the family who's elderly, those sort of things. So you have to read the regulation to see specifically what the regulation allows as exemptions to be subtracted from annual income in order to calculate adjusted income. Now, the difference is, as I mentioned earlier, annual income is the calculation of annual income, right? Your annual income, whether you're using the Section 8 definition or the IRS definition, minus your NHHBG specified exemptions and your federally mandated exemptions. That final calculation of annual income is what you're going to look at to see if the family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. Adjusted income would be annual income minus all of the adjusted amounts specified in the definition of adjusted income in this section of the NHHBG regulation. Then adjusted income is used to determine what payments will be made by that low-income family if they're going to be renting a housing unit. So again, the difference between these two are very important. Annual income minus your federally or statutorily required adjustments comes out with your annual income calculation to determine if this family is eligible to receive NHHBG assistance. On the other hand, adjusted income would be the calculation of adjusted income for determining what rent payment that family is going to pay for a rental housing unit. And as I mentioned earlier, NHHBG specifies that the family shall not pay more than 30% of their monthly adjusted income towards the rental payment for that rental housing unit. Okay, so I wanted to make sure I explained the difference between these two terms before we go on. Again, annual income is the amount that's used to determine NHHBG eligibility, and it must be used to calculate adjusted income for a tenant of a rental housing unit. Now, the method, whether DHHL uses the IRS method or the Section 8 of annual method to come up with the annual income amount, then that annual income amount is what's going to be used to calculate adjusted income. So in other words, if the IRS method was used to calculate annual income, then that annual income amount is what is going to be used to subtract all of the amounts listed in the definition of adjusted income. And if that, so in other words, DHHL cannot go back and calculate annual income on Section 8 and then figure out what is the adjusted income, right? It must all fall in line with that same method that was used to determine annual income when determining adjusted income for that family for a rental housing unit. If it is DHHL's policy to require periodic re-examination after the family is entered into the NHHBG program, then it is done to determine continued eligibility of the family for NHHBG assistance in rental units and or to calculate the monthly rent payment for that unit. This was something I had mentioned earlier, so this is just a reminder. All right, now, once we've determined, I apologize, hold on just a second. Now we want to determine income eligibility, right? So I'm sorry, I went on a little tangent when I tried to explain the difference between annual income and adjusted income. So now I want to continue on that train of thought where we're calculating annual income. And now we've calculated annual income. Now we want to determine whether that family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. So we're going to determine and verify anticipated annual income of the family's household in accordance with DHHL's written policies, DHHL's NHHBG General Admission and Occupancy Policy. We're going to ensure that all of the federally mandated and statutory exclusions are not included, right, in the calculation of annual income. Just wanted to mention that under the IRS 1040 method, I'm sorry, I think I mentioned this earlier, I'll mention it again. The household's adjusted gross income as reported for that IRS tax filing in the past 12 months is considered the anticipated annual income if using the IRS definition of annual income. Under the Section 8 method, income from the past 12 months may be considered as anticipated annual income when implementing the new Section 8 definition of annual income as modified by HOTMA. All right, so now that we've calculated the family's annual income, next we want to identify what is the current NHHBG program income limits. We also want to identify what is the family's household size, because the income limits vary by household size. Then we're going to compare the family's household annual income that we calculated earlier. We're going to compare that family's household annual income to the applicable NHHBG income limit to determine whether this family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. This is the current NHHBG income limit chart. This is a chart that gets updated every year. Every year, HUD publishes or updates the HUD income limits. The HUD income limits that are published are generally for use for the Section 8 housing programs or other housing programs. HUD takes those in, meaning me, the Hawaii ONAP office will take those HUD published income limits and review it to determine which income limits are applicable to the NHHBG program. Because under Title 8 of NHHBG, NHHBG defines median income as the HUD published income limits for the area or the HUD published income limits for the state of Hawaii, whichever is greater. So that's why there's that analysis done of the HUD published income limits for the area that's normally used by the Section 8 and public housing programs. And then Hawaii ONAP will take those income limits and compare them with the HUD income limits published just for the state of Hawaii. Then whichever income limits are greater is what is used to put together this chart of NHHBG income limits for the NHHBG program. So this chart reflects the analysis that's already done to make the comparison between the HUD income limits published for the area, meaning the county, versus the HUD published income limits for the state of Hawaii. And this is what resulted in the NHHBG income limits. So these are the current NHHBG income limits for fiscal year 2023. The new HUD income limits for fiscal year 2024 has not been published yet. So these are still the current income limits that we're using. So when you receive an application from a Native Hawaiian family who's looking for NHHBG assistance, DHHL or its service provider will go through the process of calculating annual income for the family, right? Subtracting out all of the federally mandated exclusions from annual income. And then you'll come up with that annual income for the family. Now you're going to compare that annual income calculation with the NHHBG income limit. And if the family, so say it's a 4-person family, and they're going to be, they're applying for housing assistance for housing in Honolulu. If that family's annual income calculation does not exceed this amount here, because these are the amounts at 80% of median income. So this is the greatest amount. If their income does not exceed this amount, that family could be eligible for NHHBG assistance. If DHHL creates a policy that they're going to provide assistance to families at lesser than the 80% amount, DHHL could do so. But this income limit chart is designed to measure the maximum allowed of eligibility at 80% of area median income. So I wanted to make sure I explained that clearly, that when this income limit chart is published in program guidance by HUD to say this is the updated income limits for the current fiscal year for the NHHBG program, that these income limits are established at the highest limit of 80% of area median income. And again, it's by family size and by county of where the housing is located. All right. And that's how you would determine whether the family is income eligible for NHHBG assistance. This is just to recap an example earlier when we were talking about monthly adjusted income. That monthly adjusted income is used to determine the family's maximum rent payment, the payment that the family would make towards their rent. So payments for rents and payments in lease purchase housing units may not exceed 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income. So again, you would take that calculation of annual income for the family minus the applicable deductions as defined for adjusted income in the NAHASA regulations, then that will result in your adjusted income amount for the family. Typically, the adjusted income is the annual adjusted income. So you would divide that by 12 to come out with your monthly adjusted income amount. And then you would multiply that by 30%. And if there's any utility allowance allowed, you could subtract any utility allowance, and then that would equal your maximum monthly rent or lease purchase payment allowed to be paid by the low-income family towards their rent payment. And so this was, again, just to demonstrate an example of how that would be calculated. This is a summary of my presentation today. So in summary, pursuant to Section 1006.10 in the NHHBG program regulation, DHHL has discretion in determining how to define annual income for the purpose of calculating annual household income to determine eligibility for NHHBG assistance. How DHHL makes those determinations must be included and described in its written policies. Written policies may be reevaluated and updated as necessary. And DHHL must ensure that its policies are implemented consistently and fairly. And then I'm sure DHHL, of course, would be sharing these policies with their service providers as appropriate when service providers are assisting DHHL to implement NHHBG programs. All right. So Lehua, that concludes my presentation. But if you want me to explain anything further, please let me know before we go into the question and answer session.
I don't have anything else to explain further. So what I'll do is I'll stop the recording now. So then we can take, I do see a question that was asked in the chat. And then in case